cross-disciplinary collaboration panel. So as usual, we are recording this webinar. We plan to post the recordings and slides so you can review them later. We will rebroadcast and distribute the recording. So by participating in video, audio, chat, or Q&A, you're agreeing to become part of the recording. As always, we like to thank the folks at College Bridge for sponsoring this year's and last year's conference. They're a great partner for us. So right now we have our session, and there's two parallel sessions, one on student buy-in and another one on an upcoming book by Robert Talbert. And then after that, we'll have a short wrap up. And after that, just a kind of a social hour where you can, of course, jump in and chit chat with whoever is there. So for this session, feel free to post comments and all kinds of chat type things in the chat. If you have specific questions for the panelists, we do ask you to put that in the Q&A, where you will also be able to upvote questions. Make sure to put the questions for the panelists in the Q&A to make sure that they see them, because the chat can get a little, can blow up a little bit, and we don't want to miss any of your awesome questions. So without further ado, as they say, I will let Charity and her team introduce themselves and their wonderful, wonderful project.
Hi, we just have a couple of very short slides to introduce the faculty learning community that we worked with, and then we'll leave a lot of space for questions and chatting with everybody who's in this space. So my name is Dr. Charity Levitt. Don't you love it? I teach chemistry, and I'm a chemistry faculty in the School of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics at University of Washington, Bothell. You can email me here. You can also tweet me at Charit Teach, which I'll place in the chat.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Liz Jansen, and I am a part-time lecturer at the University of Washington, Bothell in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences School, also in first year and pre-major programs. I teach composition primarily. And Charity is putting me to shame in terms of appealing to the youthful social media and music and such. You cannot tweet at me, but please feel free to use that email address for me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sagita Shukla, and I'm faculty within the School of Educational Studies, also at the University of Washington, Bothell. In addition to contacting me via the email, I will follow Charity's lead and put my Twitter handle here, so you can tweet at me using the Twitter handle here.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. David Goldstein. I teach in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. Our campus is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. I teach mostly literature and film studies, so I'm coming from a humanities background. Gloria, if you can go to the next slide, please. So what we wanted to talk about today is this faculty learning community. I think just from the four of us, you can get the sense of how disparate this learning community was. We had about 10 faculty members from across campus and one professional staff person. So the background for this learning community, we used to have a teaching and learning center on our campus that housed all of the professional development for faculty. And our current Vice Chancellor decided to change the formation of faculty development on the campus so that it's more of a model of faculty members teaching each other and learning together. So that's where the Teaching Learning Center was transitioned into what they call the Office of Connected Learning. And the major thing that that office does is support faculty learning communities. So that's the origin of where this learning community came from. So we no longer have totally dedicated faculty development professionals on our campus. And we are in this model now where we learn and teach each other. So the faculty learning community Each one on our campus gets a small amount of funding from the Office of Connected Learning. Some of that is directed toward individual participants as an incentive. It's not really, if you work out the dollars per hour that you're spending on this work, it's below the minimum wage, I'm sure. But the stipends and the spending credit is a statement of support from the Office of Connected Learning. It's a signal that the campus values this kind of work. And this kind of work can show up in P&T dossiers and will be valued. So the stipends really are a symbol of the importance of continual development in teaching. So it's roughly, I think we got a couple $100 of spending credit. That tends to work better than stipends, by the way, if you're thinking about setting something up like this on your campus, because with spending credit, we simply ask for certain things to be reimbursed. They have to be related to education. It can't be jewelry, alcohol, furs, or anything illegal. But other than that, anything that could be used in our professional work, the Office of Connected Learning will reimburse us for. And then we had a small amount of money that could be spent on behalf of the learning community as a whole. And we used that money principally to buy copies of Linda Nilsson's book. The Office of Connected Learning early on in the academic year puts out a call to see who wants to organize and who wants to be involved in particular learning communities. I live in between two hospitals, and you're probably hearing sirens in the background, so I hope it's not too distracting. And we gathered 10 official members of this learning community. Those are the ones who received actual stipends. That was the limit imposed by the Office of Connected Learning. Can't quite read the slide there. We had occasional guests coming in to join us. So we didn't really distinguish between the official members and the ones who were here to learn with us, even though they weren't getting the stipend support. So the University of Washington Bothell has 5 academic schools that are mostly upper division majors and 1 lower division general education unit that we call the first year and pre-major programs, which is where Liz teaches primarily. And all but 1 of our schools was represented. So I think that's one of the key components of the success of this learning community is the range of disciplines that were represented so that we could learn from one another. Well, I tried this in my discipline. I wonder if that would work outside of STEM disciplines, for example, and we can cross-pollinate that way. So it was a rare opportunity for us to get out of our silos and talk to other teachers in other disciplines, sometimes quite a distance afield from what we teach ourselves, and learn from what they are doing. And we also benefited from having 1 staff member, professional staff, in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences as part of the learning community. And she was able to contribute from the point of view of a staff person who supports students directly in terms of advising and academic support. So that was super important for us as well. Thanks, Gloria. Next slide.
All right, so David sort of set up some of the broader things that helped us establish this learning community. There was some institutional support in terms of financial incentives and also a little bit of organizational systems. And we also had a very diverse group of people participating in this project. People from all of the different schools were represented, and also people from different levels of their career. So we have people in part-time positions. We also have teaching professors. Both David and I are teaching professors. I'm an associate teaching professor. Dave's a full teaching professor. There are a couple of other teaching professors there. And at our institution, a teaching professor is not a tenured position, but it is a long-term contract position. So we had a lot of representation there. We also had a tenured faculty member present within the group who could participate in this project, which at some point I'll address something about how important it is to have that type of faculty buy-in for that work. But I want to discuss a little bit about how we set up this group. So for this group, the group decided how they wanted to meet. And the way that we did this is that the group got together in our first meeting and decided a set of norms, the ways we wanted to interact and behave with each other. And this was critically important whenever we were working on Zoom, because we weren't physically together. And so we spent our entire first meeting just deciding how we were going to interact with each other on Zoom. And then we set our goals as to how we wanted to work. And some things that we decided is that we wanted to be able to work both asynchronously and synchronously. Asynchronously, we decided to use that time to read the Nielsen book and a couple of journal articles that David had found. And we did that work asynchronously using an online tool that allowed us to comment on book chapters and journal articles, which for some reason I'm forgetting the name of it right now. But if anybody remembers what it was, go ahead and speak up or put it in the chat. So we did that work asynchronously. Perusal, thank you. So we used Perusal to do our discussions separately. And this was just to provide comments on the things that we were reading. Then we used our in-person time to talk about what we really wanted to do as a group, like what were types of things that we could use to advance our work. So some things that we did is that we sometimes would just share out what people had been doing. People had been practicing specifications grading in various forms. David's been using specifications grading for several years. I tried specifications grading for the first time in a preparation for general chemistry course. Then after we went through that process, we shared what we did, had a lot of time to share questions with each other. Then we also moved into the process of helping others workshop what they wanted to do for their presentations, or not for their presentations, for specifications grading in their class. And we spent a lot of time sharing what it meant to do that work. And we provided feedback on each other's ideas. We shared what we thought might work well for students, like how we set up our bundles. We provided feedback on each other on what that bundle needed to look like based off our own experiences. So we spent some of our meetings doing that. And then we also had a big plan to start doing an empirical research project on mastery grading, specifically looking at learning outcomes, student motivation, and student stress. We never quite got there, but we definitely worked towards that. We plan to continue doing some of this work in the future to look into that. But I do want to briefly mention something about faculty buy-in in terms of dynamics. So as we've hinted before, there was a large diversity of faculty involved in this project, people from different schools, but also faculty at different points in their career and positions on campus. As I mentioned, David and I were teaching professors. We also had a lot of part-time faculty. And this was actually really important because what we've seen in our campus is it's a lot of times the part-time faculty who are doing a lot of really innovative work. And so what I want to now is give Liz and Sarita a little bit of time to sort of share out what types of things helped them become a little bit more comfortable within this process to try something that is somewhat revolutionary in terms of grading.
I'll start out on behalf of part-time faculty. There were a few of us in the group, and first of all, the move to any major shift in assessment is scary, right? I think no matter the level or your position on a campus. And in teaching writing, so the field of composition being my field of expertise and where I tend to have conversations around pedagogy, we've been talking a lot for the last few years at least about moving towards more anti-racist modes of assessment and alternative modes of grading, labor-based grading, grading contracts, right? And the first time that I really shifted to anything sort of what I now understand to be close to specifications grading a couple of years ago, it was a very, very scary thing. But I had my little department, my composition faculty cohort sort of for support. I also though noticed that students are having, of course, right, hearing from students, they're having wildly different experiences. So the kinds of assessment that they were experiencing in my writing courses were maybe quite new and quite different from what they were seeing in other courses and what then they were going to be set up to expect in other courses, especially because, as David mentioned, I teach first-year students almost exclusively. So when I saw the call for a interdisciplinary group to join this learning community of faculty from across all these disciplines, I was really excited just for that opportunity. Again, as David said, to get out of our silos. I think all of us are hungry for that, but also to see how other faculty across campus are doing versions of specs grading, labor-based grading, et cetera, and to have more feedback and examples of what that can look like, both for my benefit, but also to sort of understand what my students were seeing, and really to kind of create a bit more sense of comfort in as we do this experimentation, I think is so, so important. And we're lucky to be at a campus that supports that.
So, well, I should talk about my own sort of like my own foray into this space, going back to my graduate program as when I was working on my PhD in educational psychology. One of the big concepts that really drew me was this notion of mastery goal orientation, the focus more on learning than on just the grades that students earn, where you're comparing one student to the other. So that's performance goal orientation versus mastery goal orientation. And that is something that I've always strived to have in my class, where the focus is truly on student learning than on student comparison. And then fast forward that into my work as a lecturer full-time for the School of Education, where I was really trying to grapple with this notion of grading. And I came across Jesse Stommel's work on ungrading. And then I saw David and Charity's call this academic year for the specifications grading group. One thing that truly drew me to this group was the clear description that David and Charity had for the kind of work that we would try to accomplish during this academic year. So even having a set of goals, so that you're working towards in the learning community, even a sense of curiosity about what specifications grading is. So at some level, I realized that I was applying mastery grading within my classes, but then I couldn't quite articulate the distinction between standard-based grading, for instance, contract grading, specifications grading, and truly a desire to serve students led me to this group. And I'm happy to say that the grappling that we've engaged in our group has gone beyond that. And as Liz was mentioning, this notion of bringing in equity-focused grading practices. So what does it mean to do that? And then our conversations also revealed the messiness of specifications grading based on what I heard Charity talk about, and then David shared, and then other folks in our group. I think I have now wrapped my head a little bit around what specifications grading is, and will be applying parts of it in my own classes as well.
So we've all shared out a little bit about what our faculty and learning community looked like, and some of the things that we felt helped us become a little bit more not enabled, but feel empowered to try specifications grading in our own class. This is a webinar format, so we can't see your faces, we can't see you raise hands, but we left the rest of the time just to talk to you all, to see what types of things you all are trying to find out if you're trying to get faculty buy-in on your own campus. And if there's any specific questions you will have, we're happy to answer them, or even general questions either. We're just really here to help provide those questions and feedback.
So perhaps while folks get their questions into the Q&A, I can ask a question.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this idea of this cross-disciplinary group that talked about specs grading. Could you speak to a little bit what were some of the commonalities and some of the differences based on the fact that you were in different disciplines?
I don't know who wants to take that one.
This might be a multi-person response because I think there's a lot to say in regards to that question. But one thing, it's a really good question, Gloria, and thanks. One thing that really struck me upon joining the group was how common our sort of shared goals were for implementing any new form of grading into our courses, regardless of discipline. And of course, this is a self-selecting group, but as Sarita said, really equity oriented and trying to assess student learning in a way that produce more student learning, right? That it's not only fairly captured it, but also spurs it. And it was just really cool and gratifying to see how all those conversations and goals are playing out in other disciplines. One of the major differences that struck me, and it shouldn't have been a surprise, but I teach relatively small classes. My classes are capped at usually 24 students. And so hearing about how just the labor involved in doing specs grading in larger classes, and this is something I think, Charity, you can speak to, is an important difference, and I think something important to consider. And then there were sort of our campus platform is Canvas. And there were ways that I learned how to, or got ideas about how I might streamline based on colleagues who have much larger classes than mine. But again, yeah, a difference for sure.
Sarita, did you want to go next? Or
Yes, I had a couple of, when you're talking about commonalities, Gloria, I think several key things here. Our campus is a small campus, and it is largely a commuter campus with students commuting from, we do not have sort of dedicated spaces for students to stay, so largely a commuter campus. And then a lot of our students work and take classes. And then we have a substantial first generation population as well. I think 40% of our students are first gen. And so in that sense, there's a shared sort of baseline that we were working from, which might be fairly unique when compared to other college campuses. So in that sense, there was this commonality of understanding who our students really are, and then going from there. And in terms of even thinking about the commonalities of specifications grading, the way that folks applied the specifications grading, I think what I saw in terms of commonality was more in terms of class size. Too, so larger classes, and what would specs grading look like for larger classes, and wrapping our head around that. So that was sort of some commonalities for sure. In terms of differences, certainly discipline specific was something that did come up. And for instance, Liz teaches writing, and the capstone series that I lead has a heavier writing focus. So in that sense, really trying to grapple with that at that level. So just in terms of commonalities and differences.
I wanted to do a quick note, or sorry, Gloria, did you want to ask a question?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just a note about the commonalities here is that I learned a lot about how not to do specs grading from this group because I did it wrong the first time. And so by working with this group, I learned a lot of ways that would work, especially since I teach large enrollment classes between 80 to 200 students. And so the way you do specs grading in a writing class is not the way you do it in a large lecture class. And that was really important to hear what ways not to do it, but also to figure out, by hearing what not to do, it helped me figure out some things that I could do that would help alleviate some of the stress. So that would be some of the things. And I'm seeing a couple of questions emerge in the Q&A. So I wanted to address one here about the rigor. So this is I come from a department where faculty are very staunchly against mastery grading. They feel it reduces rigor in a campus grading system that requires percentages for tests, homework, quizzes. Any advice on how to get some buy-in? I don't have such a supportive community. So what I will say is the only STEM person on this panel, I was not the only STEM person in our learning community. The way that I started to get buy-in is to connect the fact that one, we are a primarily first generation campus. So most of the students coming to our campus are first generation students. And so that means that if we want them to succeed, we need to set very clear standards as to what it means to succeed. And that you can still do mastery grading with percentages. In fact, the way that I have implemented mastery grading, other than my first failed attempt, is now I'm implementing percentages on quizzes, just because there is no way for me to go through and keep track of like which student did this question right, I just can't do it. So instead I have percentages. And basically what I say is that as long as a student meets this particular percentage on this particular type of assessment, I design that assessment so that I know if they've got that percentage on that assessment, that they've mastered that content at that level. And so that has helped to get a little bit of buy-in from my STEM colleagues to get that done. And I've gotten very little pushback from my STEM colleagues on that. Once I just say, this is the standard that needs to be met. And I back it up with some of the research from the educational literature.
Does anyone else have any follow-up to that? Or?
Well, I would say that I'm in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, and as the name implies, we have 80 full-time faculty members from a whole range of disciplines, some of which are very scientific. We have environmental scientists and so forth, all the way to experimental poets. And if I talk to the scientists and the social scientists, they say, oh, well, something like specs grading or mastery grading, that might work in humanities courses that you teach, but that wouldn't work in the rigorous courses that we teach, that like the sciences. And I say, oh yeah, well, go sit in on Dr. Lovett's class in chemistry, because you're not going to get any more STEMmy than that. And she's having great success, and she can demonstrate that her students are reaching high levels of achievement on key proficiencies. And when you give a student a D in your course, can you demonstrate that student reached that proficiency, but not that proficiency, and therefore earn the D? So you can turn the question around. Can you tell me how traditional grading enforces rigor? That seems to be the default, but let's question that assumption. And I think if you look at evidence, mastery grading, if implemented well, can help more students achieve more at a greater rate than traditional grading. It's just much more meaningful feedback to students. And these are complex, difficult things that we want students to master. So of course it takes multiple iterations. They have to practice these skills and should have multiple attempts. I can't imagine teaching someone how to drive where I'll lecture to my daughter, okay, here's how you drive. And then we get behind the wheel and she crashes on the first try, like, nope, you fail, you're out. So, so to me, returning to the evidence where we can show with mastery grading that students are achieving more and reaching higher. I can show in my courses, for example, that I added more learning activities that students are achieving. So they're getting higher grades than when I taught the same course in a traditional model, but I can demonstrate that they have learned more. So it helps to be able to push back with this cross-disciplinary learning community, knowing that I have colleagues in other schools in totally different disciplines, who are all finding successful ways of implementing specs grading or mastery grading in general.
I'll just maybe briefly add on to that as well, in that I said earlier that composition as a field has been having conversations about alternative grading at sort of the forefront of our conferences and our a lot of research in composition pedagogy. And of course, I have colleagues and I've had at other institutions primarily who are resistant. So yeah, it might be more common or less common in some disciplines. And I think we certainly experience the, well, your class's writing is less rigorous anyway, right? So we get some of that. But I've dealt with the issue of faculty buy-in. And I think as Charity and David both pointed out, using the growing evidence, right? I feel that there's no doubt that education research is skewing in this direction. So there's this growing body of empirical research, but there's also the ways that in our individual classes, so like David, when I implemented specs grading, I added labor for my students. And I can point to that being sort of more work that they're doing over time. And so I think that's really important. And the other thing I would say, perhaps at departmental levels, is prompting conversations that connect people's course outcomes to how they're grading. So when you ask fellow faculty what they want students to be able to do or have rigorously practiced over the course of your class, thinking about that seems to, in my experience, sort of organically lead into conversations around alternative assessments, because very rarely when we, again, just in my experience in humanities and composition, but very rarely does that lead to, well, being able to memorize and repeat, right, a response on an exam or something.
I would also like to add that even just the larger conversation of going back to normal, even in context of schooling and education in general, what are we getting back to, right? And so likewise, when we think about grading, so the norms, just sort of like the way that we've done it, all, that it has been done, hasn't been the most beneficial for student outcomes. And within the School of Education, we do strive to think about assessment in alternative ways, and that has been encouraged in my school. So in that sense, having that support from faculty is important. But then the interdisciplinary piece, where I get to hear how other faculty are trying it within their courses, David, Charity, Liz, just the conversations that we've had has also helped me think about specifications grading more deeply, and sort of how, when I applied, I have not applied it in my classes yet. I intend doing that in the fall quarter, but then with a full understanding of what specifications grading truly is. And then today, just Linda Nilsson's talk, and when she was talking about, I just appreciated what she was saying when she said that outcomes must be built even into the C grade. And then can we confidently say that, when a student earns an A, that they have achieved learning outcomes? What about, if a student earns a B grade or a C grade, which of those outcomes might they have attained? It then really raises questions about learning outcomes. And so really going back to the drawing board in that sense. And even, asking fellow faculty, if we are doing it the way that it has been done, are we truly, if a student earns a C grade, does it really mean that they have attained the learning outcomes that we've set out for the course, and maybe having a conversation that way?
So there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think we can maybe lump together, and they're about if you're doing mastery grading in your course and the students go to the next course that doesn't use mastery grading, I'm going to twist the question a little bit because your question was about students and we're talking about faculty buy-in. So would you say that that encourages faculty buy-in? Like, do students see that the students that came from the mastery or specs grading in your case, that those students are better prepared for the next course in the sequence? And the related question is, what about the same course with multiple sections, different instructors, one that uses specs grading or mastery grading and one that doesn't?
So I can answer this one because I'm in this exact same situation. There are two of us who teach general chemistry, and I use mastery style grading, and my other colleague does not. He uses traditional exams. Now, I'm not going to bash my other colleague. He is a passionately devoted instructor. He cares deeply about student learning. And I'm not saying like, oh, look at me, I'm doing all this. So I'm going to preface with that. I adore my colleagues. But this is the situation I'm in. I'm the one using mastery grading, and I'm the only one in chemistry using mastery grading right now. So how do I deal with that in my class? One is I make sure that my mastery outcomes are the assessments I design are very closely linked to the outcomes. So if somebody comes back to me and says, the way I implemented mastery grading is that I gave students 3 attempts on a quiz. And each quiz was restricted to a specific set of topics. And so by the time the student so they got 3 attempts on that quiz and only their highest score was kept. My colleague had just 1 exam and the students had to complete that exam. Whenever my colleague might come back and say, well, your students had lots of opportunities to guess on the questions. And I'm like, no, they didn't. They had different questions each time they took the exam. And so I could clearly say if a student has an 80% on the mastery quiz, then I know that they're doing pretty well in understanding the content. And so that gives me a lot of incentive to share that information with my colleague. And so my colleagues had basically no problem with that, partially because I've spent a lot of time in my career cultivating this notion that whatever I assess, it has to match the outcomes that I'm trying to get. And this is a constant conversation I've been having with my colleagues about what types of things are we doing, and is the stuff that we're assessing actually matching the outcomes that we want students to meet. And so that's helped reduce a lot of issues from colleagues. Yeah, and then in terms of doing this in multi-section courses, well, and how are students going to respond when they move on to the next class? Come back to me in spring or next fall. So I've had students with me for the past year doing mastery grading type things. They're going on to my colleague next week. So I should add, for all of us, if we seem a little weird, we are in finals week right now. So today is our last day of finals, and we are all pretty darn exhausted right now. And we start summer quarter in like a week. So we're all like kind of hazy right now. But come back to me in like 2 weeks and ask me how are my students doing in my colleagues course. Traditionally, students who've taken my courses have done really well in later courses because I'm very keen on mapping those student assessments to their expectations. So I'll stop it there because it's really easy for me to talk too much when I'm tired.
I would like to address Joe's question about what convinced you all to get involved in mastery grading. For me, I came across maybe 2 years ago a blog post by Kathy Davidson. At the time, I think she was at Duke University, just saying that she grades are stupid and she doesn't like them. They don't mean anything, and she's trying something else. And I think what she was trying was what she called ungrading. But that got me to think about, well, why do we do this traditional grading? You know, what does an A mean? What does a B mean? And I couldn't answer that for myself. And I thought, well, let me just try some other way of doing it. And I'm pretty sold on it. And I'm wondering, so I don't teach courses in any kind of sequence. That's one of the luxuries of teaching in my area. It's most of my courses are electives for students in Charity's school or Sarita's school. So I have a lot of students who are not even in my school who make up the bulk of my student body. If they go to the next class and tell their teacher, you know, you're using this traditional grading method, and in Professor Goldstein's class, I had to work really hard, but I was able to get an A, and I've never gotten an A in a humanities-based course. So they might become proselytizers for me, you know. I think that they might do some of the pressuring for at least the consideration of other systems of learning and assessing performance.
I think I can also maybe speak a little bit to Gloria, your part two of your question of if you're implementing any particular form of grading and faculty who teach the same course as you aren't, and specifically specs grading. So because I teach first year composition, there are a lot of sections and any given quarter. And while most of us composition faculty at UW-Bothell do primarily some form of labor-based grading, this is one of those things that might be sort of particular to non-STEM courses. So I apologize if this isn't fully relevant for everyone, but because we assess student learning through their writing and not, there isn't really a way to do exams or for students to have a right answer on a quiz or something, or get an experiment right. This is betraying just how little I know about what goes on in something like a chemistry class. But it makes it easier, and this I think goes for any class that uses writing, and I know a lot of STEM classes do, as a means of assessment. It's a good place to talk about, what do we mean when we say good writing? Or what do we mean when we say, and I'm going to look to the question again, but yes, this is Carl's question, that a student has done a great job or an outstanding job. What do we actually mean by that? And really the question is, what underlying biases might be informing what we consider good or great or outstanding, because those are highly variable and they have everything to do with individual instructor positionality. And so this goes to Joe's question as well about what brought me to specs grading, is trying to undo a little bit of that, which is built into all of us and is inevitable in how we interact with our students, and but to create just a more equitable playing field so that I'm not, for example, unconsciously privileging students who are native English speakers, right? When they might have come in with skills that, if anything, might have worked against their developing their writing, which comes back to the course outcomes, right? Which, and again, something like composition courses are all about development of skills rather than expertise per se.
I would also like to add, and Liz's comments reminds me of Sylvia's presentation and her use of contract grading in her classes. And so how do you define an A? And so how this other learning community member, they try to apply contract grading within their class is in the first quarter, the students work with them. So the instructor builds this relationship with students. And then in the second quarter, the instructor has a rubric that the students would then use for the writing assessment for the class that is very heavily writing based. And then the students then discuss with each other and the instructor, and then they create those criterion for what the A means, what does a B mean? And then that's the system that the instructor used. And I found that fairly helpful in even thinking ahead to my own work. So when I create the specifications grading piece, and I would not just slap it on to my students, but then how do I create that student buy-in, which is by sharing this with them, being vulnerable and saying, this is something that I would like to try in this class. I have not done this before. How can we discuss this? And does this make sense to you? Are there any parts that are unclear? Are there any parts that I'm missing that probably should have been in this assessment plan that I have, and then to take that feedback in. So it's not that I'm going in with an empty, and just just beginning with that question, but having something, a solid sort of like here's the plan, and then but also allowing students to provide that input. In sort of determining what that A might look like, what would the A work be, and then using that and not grading on a curve, going back again. So if all students meet that criterion, everybody can earn an A. So it's not the number of students, but are you truly working towards the learning outcomes? And is the assessment, going back to Charity's point, is the assessment matching the learning outcomes? So really grappling with that with the students as well. And I'll share the link to our learning community website, wherein everybody's contributed and sort of like how they've applied it or are planning to apply it. And let me do that right now.
Yeah. I want to answer a question that's been emerging in the chat, which is about agreement on what letter grades mean and what it means if students meet all the objectives, and in particular, how this applies to faculty pushback. So as one, I think that has to really counter our assumptions as faculty. Is it a problem if students get all A's? Is it really that bad if they master the content at that level? And this is making the assumption that you set your objectives that high. So like, I'm gonna push back on that whole assumption, especially as somebody coming from STEM. Is it a bad thing if all the engineers in our class get an A in chemistry? And I'm going to say no, because I want my engineers to know the chemical principles for the bridge design. Like, I want them to have an A. And if they've all gotten an A, then that means I've structured my class so that they get it. For my faculty, so one, I've never had that happen. The most I've gotten is that I've gotten nearly everybody to pass with a 2.0 or higher, which even then I've gotten a little bit of pushback from colleagues on like, well, if nobody failed your class, is it really hard enough? And my pushback on other colleagues is, well, if 50% of the class is failing your class, are you really teaching it? And that maybe, I try to say it a little bit nicer than that, but like, I do feel very passionately, if a number of students are failing your class, it's not the student's fault at that point, that it actually is something that is going on with the faculty. And there's a lot of research to back that up. So in terms of that, like, that's how I deal with the, if everybody gets an A, it's not a problem question. So yeah, I'll go ahead and stop on that. And then Gloria, was there like some other questions you think we'd like to prioritize?
So I think we've touched upon this a little bit, but I think this is one that is very common, and it comes back to kind of not feeling alone. How can you get folks who are not interested in doing this to get them to sign up to maybe join a community of practice, or to even, dip their toes in the water of alternative assessments and grading?
I think at least nominally, faculty at least claim to base decisions on evidence. And there's a small but growing body of evidence, empirical evidence, that these alternative grading systems create more student learning. Sometimes, so I don't think that it is the time savings for faculty. I don't feel like I'm spending less time. So if there's a way of doing that so that my students are learning more and I'm working less, please someone organize a session around that. I'll sign up for it. But if we can confront faculty with empirical evidence that students learn more with alternative grading, at least generally, and when it's well implemented, I don't know how they can argue with that. You know, it should be at least enough for them to consider and maybe participate in a community of other like-minded faculty members who are, okay, I'm willing to start considering some alternative mode. And let's learn how to do this together. And that's essentially the origin of our faculty learning community. Some of us were brand new to it. Some of us have experimented a little bit, but none of us are an expert at it. I don't know, if, other than Linda Nilsson, I don't know if there is an expert. But I think just the fact that there is some empirical evidence that this system can add to student learning and can motivate students internally should be enough to get some faculty members at least to think about it. You'll never reach everyone, but if you can slowly change the culture in a department, in a school, in a campus, in a university, and then eventually the US higher education system, maybe you can get a few people started with you. Charity, you're raising a hand in your own session. You're muted.
You're muted, Charity.
That's how we do it in our own faculty sessions. We raise that. Yeah, so just a note here on terms of like faculty buy-in for the faculty who are nominally involved. It also addresses this point on A's. Students who, if students are getting A's, if they're all getting A's, that's great. To David's point about giving more assignments, yes, I also gave them more assignments. So like I had students doing presentations in general chemistry. They presented on content that was brand new, and none of my colleagues have ever done that. And so like that was a bonus thing. It was totally optional, but they did it. So that helped a lot. And even though this session is on faculty buy-in, I think one key piece of this is that having student buy-in helps make it easier for other faculty to do it. And in terms of student buy-in, what I mean here is, one, this doesn't mean my course evaluations have gone up. Granted, this is COVID, and I don't know about you all, but my course evaluations tanked on that. But what I do have are really great stories from students on how they now think more deeply about the concepts. I actually got an email from a student this morning who said, wow, I never thought I'd learn to like chemistry. And now all I do is think about energy and how I can get more energy from the system and the surround, like how did this energy between the system and the surroundings interact with each other? And she's like, what are more books I can read? And my colleagues complain about not getting questions, students asking questions like that. And I'm like, guess what? I just had, not just one, I had 6 students ask me if I could get more information. So that to me shows student buy-in. And if that's what my faculty want, then I'm like, that's what you should do. So that's one way I've gotten faculty buy-in.
Okay, so I think we're just about ready to wrap up. We probably have another minute or so. If you guys had any closing things that you wanted to mention in general about getting fellow faculty, wrangling them in, or about your experiences or specs grading?
I'd just like to say, sort of in response to something Joe put in the chat, but also just as a, I've certainly had the experience of working at multiple institutions and not feeling like I could, as part-time or contingent faculty, do as much as I wanted to do in terms of revising my curriculum, in terms of committee work, et cetera, or something like a learning community. And I know how many faculty are in that boat at most campuses. approaching this kind of work with a spirit of generosity and sharing, both within and across disciplines, I think can also go a long way to create buy-in. While in individual courses, it might not be less laborious in terms of grading those students, creating a sense of, right, this is work that others are doing, others are trying, right, having some successes, some failures with, I think can really go a long way, because I do think more of us want just community around things that we're doing than maybe we realize.
I would also like to add that in terms of faculty buy-in, we often talk about student belonging. Do students feel like they are a part of the campus and that they are a part of the classroom? I think that a space like this learning community, what it does is it creates a sense of belonging for faculty. It did that for me, that I'm a part of this group and that I could ask silly questions about grading and grapple with grading and teaching learning, because grading is invariably tied to assessment, to teaching in all its varied aspects, and to normalize that feeling that there are oh moments and aha moments, and that there are other folk who are also experiencing the same things that I'm experiencing, truly helped, especially during this pandemic year when we had this learning community. So in terms of faculty buy-in, I think creating those spaces on campus wherein you can share that. And I never had a chance to interact with Charity or David or Liz outside of this learning community, but now I think I know them, and when I see them on campus, that there's folks outside of my small silo of educational studies that I know that I can connect with. So in that sense, it's truly helpful.
Okay, great. So we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to have a brief wrap-up session. There's a separate Zoom link for that. And a little bit after that, an optional social gathering where we can ask questions to whoever's there and chit chat with other folks. I would love to thank our amazing panel for their really super interesting project and their thoughtful answers to everyone's questions. You guys have been wonderful. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're happy to answer any more. Sarita sent the link to our site. We apologize. We are very sleep deprived right now. So I apologize if we weren't fully coherent. Give us like a week or so to sleep and then we'll be able to be more coherent.
You guys were amazing. So if that was not coherent, wow.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you all very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Owen.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria.
Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Owen.
Thank you all very much. It was wonderful. It was really great.
People ask good questions.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So we should head out. Bye.
Back to